is a different introduction to the episode. In this episode, we will be discussing reproductive rights and all things surrounding that, all of the changes that have taken place. This is an important topic for us as voters to be educated on what's at stake and to have this education as we cast our ballots in November. The other part of this episode, which is why this episode is beginning differently than any of the others, is because I think it's a responsible thing to do to take a few moments to share my story. In my late teens until my late 20s, I was in a very long-standing relationship. During that time, I became pregnant twice. I do not have children, which means that I made the difficult decision to terminate both pregnancies. This is not an easy topic for me to discuss. This is a topic that, aside from close girlfriends, no one knows this about me because I have carried a lot of shame around this for several years. I imagine that someone listening may be able to relate to this as well, which is why it's important for me to share my story, to let everyone know why this is such an important topic and why it is so personal for me. And so that you can also hopefully feel less alone in your journey if you are not at the point where you are able or desire to share your story. Terminating a pregnancy looks like different things for different people. There are people who have to terminate a pregnancy due to sexual assault. There are people who have to terminate a pregnancy for their health, for fear of being in an abusive relationship. I chose to terminate the pregnancies because I was in my very early 20s, had no financial resources to support a child, and I also mentally was not ready nor able to be the mother that I one day desired to be, the example that was set for me in terms of what a mother is. And although those were difficult decisions, and I acknowledge that this is not a proud moment by any means. I have to acknowledge that me being participating in irresponsible behavior led to me having to make these decisions. However, I am confident that I made the right decision for myself and my life at the time. And I respect both sides of this argument, pro-life as well as pro-choice. To state my stance, I am very pro-choice. However, for those on the other side of this argument, I encourage you to approach this topic with compassion as well as sensitivity for those who may have had to make that difficult decision at some point. And you actually may know someone who has had to make this decision and they just haven't been able to speak about it. They may never be able to speak about it. It's a personal choice. But to lead into this episode, I just want to encourage us to keep an open mind. This is not, me sharing my story is not at all meant to persuade anyone, change minds. It's simply to educate and for us to have an idea of the importance of this topic and the severity of it. So with that being said, let's get into this episode. And thank you for giving me the space to share a little bit about my story. Well, Style Crew, we are back for another episode. We are still in our election series, and this episode is discussing reproductive rights. And I'm very excited because I have activist Alison Amoroso joining us for this episode to discuss this very complex issue, educate us on everything related to reproductive rights and just everything that we need to know and should be considering as we make a very important decision on November 5th. So, Alison, I want to welcome you to the show. We're really grateful to have you and just explore this topic.
Thank you. I love your show.
Thank you so much. It's possible by having great guests such as yourself. So I want to start it out by asking you, can you walk us through your journey and to becoming a reproductive rights activist and why this topic is so important to you to speak boldly about it?
Well, I didn't come to it in my activism early, because when I first started to learn, like, wow, people can have effects and influence and can make the world a better place. I was, in high school, and I grew up below the Mason-Dixon line, but in Maryland. It was in a very poor area, which had been a slave area, and so there was, KKK threats at my high school. There were race fights, and there was a lot more violence back in those days too. And so I began really trying to understand, I didn't really understand why there was racism anyhow. I wasn't born there. I was born in the Northeast, and then I lived outside of Washington, and there was, there's always racism everywhere, but I didn't see it like I did down there. And so I became an activist in that way in my high school. And then I became involved in domestic violence, trying to the domestic violence at that time, there wasn't the same laws that we have now. I mean, basically, women were more under the power of their spouse, or even an unmarried spouse. A boyfriend. And so I became involved in that way. And then I was a peer counselor, and I worked with other teenagers, and there was a lot of teenage pregnancies in my high school, and I was a peer counselor for this one girl, and she became pregnant after I started working with her. But in my homeroom, there was a girl who had more than one pregnancy. And I remember we were like, well, what, why? We were talking to her like, what? And she didn't know how she got pregnant. She just didn't know how. She said, I didn't know.
How old were you all?
16, 17. Oh. She's like, I didn't hear the bell ring. And we're like, what bell? What bell ring? And she said she was told there would be bells, she'd hear a bell ring if she could get pregnant. There was just such a lack of information, and it was so sad that the girl that I was working with, because it changed her whole life. She was only like 16, 17. Not that many people in my high school went to college, and especially girls didn't. So I kind of had all this kind of swirling around in my head. And then in college, I majored in psychology, and I started working with a family where there was incest in the family. So I started doing a lot of research, and I did a clinical work at the Duke Psychology Clinic on incest. And so, that I was raised Catholic. And so when I learned how prevalent, incest was in the in Catholic families, and I had friends who were Catholic that were sexually abused too. So it wasn't a surprise to me because I had a couple of friends who were Catholic that were,
and they had shared their experience with you.
Yeah. A lot of times people wouldn't necessarily, but because I was researching and working with it, people would tell me, oh yeah, that happened to me. So that happened. Yeah. So that happened quite a bit. And then so when I learned about incest and then domestic violence and racism, I started, to kind of see more patterns here. And then after college, I was a social worker, and then I got my master's in counseling, and I was a child abuse social worker. But I had so many clients, so many who, I'll never forget their stories. It's just, a girl who was 13 who got pregnant, and the mom said, "No, keep it, because I'll take care of it." And of course, the mother never took care of it because she let her 13-year-old get pregnant anyhow. So she. And she just always felt guilty, even if you end up keeping the baby so many times, you end up feeling like resentful of the baby, and then you hate yourself. And it's just a horrible way to grow up, really. You're growing up with the child. And then, I have other situations of kids in foster care who couldn't get an abortion because they were wards of the state, their own parents couldn't really advocate for them. Well, they could, but it was very hard for them. Anyway, there were so many stories and so many lives affected by having a pregnancy that you don't want, or you physically can't handle, or emotionally. And so I realized that at the crux of so many social ills is really not being up for a woman to be able to control their own reproduction, to have any efficacy around, or agency. I'm sorry, that's the wrong word. Agency around their body. Mm-hmm. Your education, and so many people's education were ruined. And then so many friends I know who got pregnant in college, but then had the abortion and then went on to be successful and had a family when they were older and ready, versus the people who didn't, who ended up dropping out of college or not going to college because they got pregnant. I mean, there's always exceptions. You always meet people that were able to pull it off. But by and large, it is really a life-changing situation. And most people who have children when they're very young grow up in poverty and stay in poverty. It's very rare not to get out of that cycle. So that's one of the reasons. A lot of my work's really been about anti-poverty too, because in this country, reproduction and poverty go hand in hand. So we don't have good safety nets here. It might be different if the country, helped you, but if they're not going to help you, you end up basically being poor.
It's definitely an intersection, and I appreciate you acknowledging that, because it's the truth. And that's actually something that's in one of the questions that we'll talk about later. But I think it is very true that when you don't have the resources necessary already to sustain yourself and be able to access a better life through means like education, or even if it's not like a 4-year university, a 2-year, just if you don't have the means for that, and then you add on the stress of an unwanted pregnancy, and you already don't have the resources to provide for yourself, much less another human being, then comes into the question of, are you then able to get proper medical care during your pregnancy? Are you able to get postnatal care? Is your child able to get postnatal care? And it's very layered. So I'm glad that you touched on that, just the importance of it.
Well, I think people don't realize too, when they talk about these issues, in much of the country, you can't take sick days. If you have a low-wage job, entry-level job, and you're pregnant, you're supposed to go to work, or you can lose your job. So or to your point, vocational training schools, it's very hard to go to school if you don't feel good or to learn. And so now you've got another human being you're responsible for, and you can't even get your own education finished. And and even if you might have a kid. I mean, we're talking about first time mothers, but what if you already have a kid? It's even worse, because now you have a kid to take care of and yourself and work. It's really a no-win situation. And it's why so many families really struggle with young children.
All around, just maternity leave isn't really even.
Oh, people go, there's FMLA. Oh, there's no, that's only for large companies. Yep. Paid FMLA is only for large companies. So, over a certain, there's a threshold. So, when the Clintons were working on that legislation years ago, they had to compromise because the legislature wouldn't pass it if it was required for all businesses. So they put in these exceptions where only larger companies have to have paid leave, and otherwise you can't be fired. But not small companies, not entrepreneurial companies, they don't have to follow a lot of those rules. So people don't realize how hard it is if you live in a small town, or you don't work for a big company, how to even have any stability.
Mm-hmm. And these are the people that are affected by these policies and these bans. I just want to take a step back. Can you educate the listeners on something that you just touched on? You spoke about the Clintons trying to get this pushed through, the maternity. Can you educate us on that?
Well, it's not maternity. It's Family Medical Leave Act. Okay. So it could be for your parent, if you have a parent that you're taking care of, or a spouse or a child. So, maternity care is covered under disability insurance, but you have to have that insurance for it to be covered. Yes. So there are laws that you can't fire. Now there are laws that you can't fire pregnant people, but you don't have to pay them while they're out sick. I mean, some states are more generous than others, but by and large, all the states with the bans are the ones that don't have good protections and any generous benefits. It's almost a one-to-one mapping. There's some exceptions.
How interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's really not about protecting your family, and I just it's that drives me crazy. The hypocrisy about, to take care of families, but then not helping a family have any stability, especially in those early years, is really hard.
Very much so. So since you began your career in activism, what milestones have you witnessed regarding reproductive rights? And then what regression have you also seen, in addition to the obvious overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022?
Well, what's interesting to me, when I was very young, like I said, I was raised Catholic, nobody ever talked about abortion.
Really?
It's not even in the Bible. I mean, if you look in the Catholic religion, at least, I mean, and there's been infanticide, and there's stories about infanticide all through history. So, the idea that a pregnancy was this, sacred place. I mean, when I grew up, raised in a Catholic church, it was very much about social justice. That's what we talked about all the time. We never talked about abortion. It wasn't until the mid 80s when it became like a political thing. Now, there were groups in the United States that were always sort of against abortion, but it wasn't legal, but it wasn't illegal to the way that you would go to jail for it, or the doctor would lose their license. I mean, I'm generalizing. It's a big country, and every state and jurisdiction is a little different, but it just wasn't a topic until it became a political weapon, probably in the 80s. And that's when you saw, a lot of activism against, but it wasn't just abortion. I mean, it was also birth control. Catholics changed a lot over the years, but they were still, you're not supposed to use birth control if you're
Mhm.
a real Catholic. But the milestone that's the most important was when it became a national law. I forget what year that was, 90 or 91, where it was a national law that protected women all over the country. And that's lawsuit Roe versus Wade. But it was a compromise also. I mean, a lot of the people advocating for legal abortion had something much different in mind. This law was a compromise, and it only probably came about because there was a woman on the Supreme Court. She was the one that wrote the opinions, Sandra Day O'Connor. I remember reading it. There's something in that rule about how just being a woman and a mother makes you special. It's like, at this point, I had been a therapist, a sexual abuse counselor for a long time, and there's a lot of women that it doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man. It doesn't. It's just because you're pregnant doesn't make you like an angel. I mean, So there's this idolism, what they call like this virgin versus slut. Like if you're the mother Mary versus slut. Like you can't really be a real person. You're like this archetype of either a slut or a virgin, and so. I think that came out a little bit in that ruling, if you read that ruling, but it did allow states and other jurisdictions, no more could they penalize women or doctors or families and outlaw abortion, which was starting to happen more and more. So, but there was never like a national law against abortion. It was just state by state or jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And then this federal Supreme Court ruling basically said that it's the law of the land, that jurisdictions can't change it. And that's been that way since that court case, Roe versus Wade. And so after that, there was a lot of activism in the religious right to try to stop different kinds of birth control. So that has gone on all over the country since then. So it wasn't, okay, well, we can't stop abortion, but let's stop, birth control. So that, and also like who gets to make the decision? Is it the father or who's in charge? So that's been a political hot potato too. So I think over the years, women have gotten a lot more power, but it took it's taken a long time, and now a lot of experts have said women are losing a lot of power now. It's still better than it was, though.
This is true. But I want to ask you, in terms of in your experience and also your opinion on this topic, why do you think that it became? You mentioned it becoming politicized at a certain point. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I'm not a historian, but my understanding is when the political party, we have a two-party political system. So when the parties started to realign, because the Republicans used to be much more moderate, but when they realigned to try to get more votes, they connected with religious right groups, so it was a merging. And so, if you look back at the Eisenhower years, or even Nixon did a lot of things that modern people today would think were progressive, even or liberal. I mean, you had Republicans back then that were pro reproductive rights, but it's hard to find that now. But it didn't used to be like that. So I think it was just a way to form voting blocks and groups and things. So, and the Democrats were not always this way like they are today about reproductive rights, because I've heard the Blue Dog Democrats, or there were lots of Democrats who consider themselves moderate, and that was one way to define themselves, being anti-abortion. They would say, "Well, I'm pro-life," so they would make them more moderate to people. A lot of Americans don't understand those terms. Like, they don't realize what those terms mean, so they kind of just throw them around, or politicians would throw them around, and then people didn't realize what was going on.
Can you educate us on what is the term pro-life mean, and what does the term pro-choice mean?
Well, I didn't coin those terms, but
Right.
pro-life movements have used it to be mostly against abortion, any kind of abortion, or and some birth control.
Mm-hmm.
So there'd be no birth control. And then pro-choice, I think, came as a response. I remember when we were getting into that activism. So I didn't tell you earlier, but I founded a nonprofit for girls, teenage girls, in 1980, 88, 89. So the pro-choice kind of came as an anti-pro-life, because it was like, what are you going to be? You're not pro-death, right? You're like, it's about women's having choices. So, language changes over time, but now you call it reproductive rights, which is kind of what we were trying to say back then. And a lot of times after Roe versus Wade, after we won the right to for abortion, a lot of the work was about having teenagers having opportunities to get birth control, to have access to birth control, when can a girl make their own decision about their having an abortion? Because most states are like, okay, well, it's legal, but it's not legal unless you're 18, or it's not legal with your parents' permission. And so the states started putting in rules to control teenagers, and that was really the space I was involved in too. And it's like that now. I mean, God, if you're raped now, or you were pregnant because it was a family member, what do you have to go to another family member and get permission to get an abortion? I mean, it may not be your father, it could be your uncle or your stepfather, whatever. It's horrible. And the same now, even the states that have so-called exceptions for rape and incest, you still have to go to the police and have evidence and have a report. I was doing some voter education work recently. When I talked to teenagers, no teenager once they hear that, they're like, oh my God, no, that's not going to happen. They don't want to go to the police, and somebody would have to advocate for them and bring them. It would be hard. So they think, oh yeah, you just go to the clinic and go to your doctor and get an abortion and tell them you were raped. No, it doesn't work that way.
Because so we also have to take into account, like what you're saying, this is already a traumatic experience. You've experienced sexual assault, and to take it a level deeper, let's just say it's a situation where it's incest, and you don't know what this family member has told this child, if there has been a threat, if this is something that has just occurred on multiple occasions within their family and it's continued to be swept under the rug. So then you have to consider, okay, this child, it may or may not be taken seriously. And then it's such a layered, complex, and just yeah.
Well, and also, even if it's not a family member, a lot of date rape and rape, the girls are in the school with these boys. So, and you can be ostracized. I mean, I saw it in my own high school, and it happened to a friend of mine. I mean, it is really hard to come out about something like that, especially if you don't support. But the other thing is, a lot of people don't realize is a lot of girls and women who are sexually assaulted have like a cognitive delay or a mental illness or developmental delay, because they're more vulnerable. And those poor girls, they have really very little options, because they might not know what's happening. They don't know who to tell. And by the time they find out they're pregnant, I mean, they can't even, and then to file a police report after that. I mean, that's just cruel, really. Well, the whole thing is cruel.
It is. And then I can't imagine being in a situation where I have suffered sexual assault, either by someone I knew, didn't know, whatever the case may be, and then to find out that I'm pregnant as a result of that.
And, a lot of times they really don't know, because they're still young, their periods aren't regular. And so they don't know what's happening to them, or they didn't And there's not very good. So the sexual health curriculums across the country are not consistent. There's no curriculum that everybody just uses, right? So some states have abstinent only curriculums, and they don't even. So a lot of times the kids don't even know what's happening. Like that girl I was telling you about in my high school, in the 80s, like that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, there are still kids growing up that don't know how reproduction works or what's happening to them. So, I mean, it's really a travesty that there are adults in this country and school boards that don't have care about good sexual health. I mean, it's not just reproduction. I mean, it's STDs. There's serious STD rates that are going up. And if you're pregnant and you have a serious STD, that fetus can be affected and can be disabled by STD. And if you can't have an abortion, then all of a sudden what happens? You have a newborn fetus with a disability because of a sexually transmitted infection. Or in the case like Zika, a mosquito-borne infection. I mean, and so now you've got an infection and you can't have an abortion, and that Zika could cause encephalitis, the swelling of the head. I mean, it's horrible.
It's
sorry.
No, you're listen, I'm very aware this is an important issue. I will say that. I'm trying to just allow you the space to educate us in this space, because it's mind-blowing. I will say that much. So I want to take it back a step. So on January 22nd, 1973 is when the United States Supreme Court issued the 7-2 decision in Roe versus Wade, which protected a woman's right to choose. Now, just to provide the listeners with a little education, I am referring to an article from Britannica.com, which I will be sure to link in the episode bio. But for more information, so this case actually began in 1970 when, in air quotes, Jane Roe, this is a fictional name used to protect the identity of the plaintiff, she instituted federal action against Henry Wade, who at the time was the district attorney of Dallas County, Texas, which is where Roe resided. The Supreme Court disagreed with Roe's assertion of an absolute right to terminate pregnancy in any way and at any time. Instead, it attempted to balance what it regarded as a fundamental right to privacy with the state's compelling interest in protecting the health of a pregnant person and the potentiality of human life. In doing this, the court formulated a timetable based on the notions of trimester and fetal viability, i.e., the capability of meaningful life outside the mother's womb. During the first trimester of pregnancy, the court ruled that the state could not intervene in a person's decision to have an abortion under normal circumstances. During the second trimester, the state could regulate abortion procedures to protect the health of a pregnant person, but could not prohibit abortions altogether. From the end of the second trimester, which the court identified as the starting point of viability, the state could regulate or prohibit abortions in order to protect the pregnant person's health or to preserve fetal viability. In no case, however, could the state criminalize abortions that were necessary to protect the life or health of the pregnant person. So, with that being said, can you walk us through the effects that this ruling in 1973 by the Supreme Court had on reproductive rights and how this ruling was received at that time?
Well, I was very young, so I don't really remember.
I know. I was gonna say, girl, I know you're still a young buck.
Right. And so thank you for sharing the history, because I was starting in my youth in the 90s where there was again threats to overturn Roe versus Wade, but then, as I mentioned, there were a lot of states that were putting in other laws along the way. So, I mean, so I think when it first happened in 1973, it was a landmark for women because, and then also birth control, the pill was starting to be used more widely because when you can control your reproduction, then you can control what's happening to you in other, staying in a bad marriage or abusive marriage. Like I said earlier, I was involved in domestic violence. A lot of women ended up getting stuck in those marriages because they, were getting raped, or they kept just, getting forced to have more kids or got pregnant accidentally. And so that was a real game changer for women, that they could not be forced to have a pregnancy that they didn't want or couldn't carry, or didn't feel like they wanted to bring a child into with a father that was so violent. So I think that's where you really start to see women being able to also feel comfortable advocating in the workplace and for rights and equal pay. So that's what they call, the second wave, I guess, the women's movement.
So essentially, so what I'm hearing you say is, what I believe I'm hearing you say is, like, it had a ripple effect on rights, not just reproductive wise, but in other areas that women previously had not had enough autonomy, really.
Right, because if you're, forced to have a kid, and women were still being forced to get married young in those days too. I mean, there's still segments of this country where they're being forced to get married too. So, yeah, I mean, it changed your whole trajectory now on how you see yourself. So it was a game changer.
Okay, I'm glad we explored that, because I would not have even thought about that from that ruling. So I honestly, just to be honest with you, I was thinking very surface level in terms of what was the reception, thinking about now knowing that I was alive and I remember where I was when Roe versus Wade was overturned, and seeing the fallout from that. I actually was thinking of that. And I'm obviously very aware of the ripple effect from that decision, but I didn't even consider that ruling having a positive impact on other areas for women. So I'm glad that you shared that. It's very much a full circle.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know about your family, but my grandmother had 12 brothers and sisters. I mean, so your life is completely different.
Yes.
If you are just basically having one kid after another, and you're a lot less healthy too, because you need time in between.
Yes.
The pregnancies. And I think the other thing people don't realize is, maternal mortality. I mean, women just, every pregnancy was like potential death. I mean, it's really just modern medicine that has kept women from hemorrhaging during birth. It's really, or if you have I need my own daughter, she didn't have enough oxygen coming out. If they didn't have modern medicine, she would have been, she would have been developmentally delayed. So I think that people don't realize that this whole discussion about forced birth and abortion is, a lot of times when they say, fetal viability, that's only with modern medicine. If you're having the baby out far away from a hospital or medical provider, there's a good chance you can have a complication, especially depending on your age. So if you're really young, you have a very high chance of infection of complication. And if you're older than 35, and those are the two, not coincidentally, those are the two age groups that have the highest rates of abortion: teenagers and 35 and over, because those are where the most of the complications come in. It's just not, there's so many girls' bodies just are not ready to give birth at those younger years.
I didn't even think about that statistic, that historically what you're sharing, those are the groups that are more likely to have an abortion. Yeah.
That's the stats when abortion happens. And a lot of times it's because you already have 3 or 4 kids, or you're, or I had a friend who had a really bad medical condition, and her and her husband both like had low paid jobs. They already had 2 kids, very happy. She would have to be on bed rest the entire pregnancy. How are they going to feed the 2 kids they have?
Yeah.
And they weren't poor enough to get Medicaid, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that happens, and people think, oh, the life of the mother. That's like extreme, the life of the mother. What about all the woman suffering during pregnancy? So that's what really irritates me the most about this, is that mostly the men that are making these decisions just have no idea how hard it is to be pregnant for most women.
No. And it's clear that that's not a concern.
No, I don't care. I don't care.
Not at all. No.
And they don't even know, like, you can't even take much medicine when you're pregnant because it would hurt the fetus. They don't even know that. They don't even know, like, modern medicine to relieve the symptoms. It's just not available to you. I have some medical issues, so I could not take a lot of medicine. And, it's you end up having, it's a grueling, for most women, it's grueling, especially in certain age groups. So yeah, that's probably why you're seeing at the older age. Well, there's more fetal anomalies also at the older years.
And it's important that we acknowledge how difficult carrying a child full term can be, because this is what is necessary in order to keep the world's population going. Women have to carry children, but we have to acknowledge women need to be taken care of, and decisions need to be made for us to actually be cared for in order for that to happen. And like you just acknowledged, that if you have certain medical conditions or even just being pregnant, there's certain medications that unfortunately you aren't able to take. And each person's body is different. I've encountered women who don't just have morning sickness the first trimester or the first month. They have it through the duration, and not just morning sickness, actual violently
for some women, it's
their entire pregnancy.
Right. It's a hard thing, and for also, it's very hard on your heart. So it's the hardest thing a human, men and women combined, can ever do to their body, is to have pregnancy and birth. It's very stressful. So you have any kind of heart issues, you're also at risk. And so, that's really the irritant to me about this life of the mother. I mean, really, you're going to wait till she has a heart attack on and 7 months pregnant? I mean, because you can't tell, really. You don't know if someone's and these laws really are so far out of the scientific mainstream. The people that making them, I don't understand. I mean, I know people in my life who are very, very, they say they're very Catholic and they're the sanctity of life or something, but they don't really take a look at the embryonic development and the fetal development. It's not, I remember when I was, when I had a nonprofit with the teenagers, there was one group of girls that we worked with where their church was showing them pictures of like conception, and they actually had miniature pictures of humans, as if when like at the stages of development, that they're just like shrunken humans.
That's not how that happens.
And I've gotten stuff in my email box too. So there's a lot of people that really don't know what the human development stages look like. They just think that the the embryo and the fetus are like just miniature, the organs are. Well, I don't know exactly where your listeners are from, but a lot of these states, like Georgia, where I live, have the heartbeat ban.
Yes, at 6 weeks.
There's no heartbeat. There's no heart, and there's no heartbeat, and there's no heart. So
yes.
It's like, why are you telling people that? You're trying to get on people's sympathies, and you're making people stupid because you're teaching them that there's a heart at 6 weeks when there's not. And you're the governor, and you should know better than that. You should know better than try to fool and manipulate people. It's not right.
But it goes back to what you just said about, let's take it back to the education. If the education in schools is not, it's not the same across the board. And so depending on the curriculum and what is being taught, if that's what's being taught is, oh, there's, this heartbeat at conception, or if these, I don't know, I haven't been in school in a while. If that's what the heartbeat, if as soon as there's sexual intimacy, then this is what a child looks like at this point, if these images are still being shown or whatever is being said. And also, to take it a step further than that, if someone isn't doing the research on their own and educating themselves on, okay, when does an embryo actually become a fetus and have a heartbeat? I think for a couple of reasons. One, if it's not something that they feel is affecting them directly in that second, in that moment, then there's no motivation to do so. And the second thing is just going based off what is being pushed to you as, oh, well, this is it, 6 weeks. And a lot of women don't even know they're pregnant until that point. So I know I shared my story at the beginning of the episode, but I was the first pregnancy that I terminated. I was 6 weeks when I found out. And I just was, I was so young. I was 20. I was a few months away from turning 21. Had a long time boyfriend, and I had been on birth control for years. We were long distance for a few months. So I made the decision to give my body a break from birth control. And I had planned on getting back on it, but I just wasn't. Again, I was 20, and I wasn't thinking about, I had never been pregnant before. So I wasn't thinking about, oh, like this can happen. And I just, I had a workout one day. I used to go to like our student center to get meals, and I would get a foot-long sandwich. I could eat that back then. And I used to like bust it down, no question. And then one day I took a bite and I was just disgusted.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, oh, maybe it's the mayonnaise. And I was like, maybe the mayonnaise is bad. So I put it in the refrigerator. I was like, I'll finish it tomorrow. I'm not wanting to throw away food. And then the next morning I woke up like ready to start my day, eat per usual, and I got sick instantly. And then I thought about it and I was like, when was the last time you had your period? Oh. Because now as an adult, I track it. Then I didn't.
Right.
I don't even know if there were tracking apps at this time. This was,
you'd have to like
13 years ago.
And, I mean,
yeah, this was like 13, 14 years ago. And so I went and got, I went to the Dollar Tree. Girl, I was so poor. I was in college. I went to the Dollar Tree for a pregnancy test. Let me tell everybody out there, if you're getting pregnancy tests from Dollar Tree, it's not it. You're not ready to be anybody's mother, period. And I bought 2 pregnancy tests because that $2, that's what I could afford. And they both came back positive. And I was like, no, this isn't true. This can't be. And so I looked up, I did some research, and I was like, well, they say when you first urinate in the morning, that's when it's the most accurate. So I went and splurged. I think I bought like a Clear Blue Easy for like $15. And I was like, I'll take this first thing in the morning. I took it first thing in the morning, and that came back positive. And I was like, no, like trying to wish it away.
Yeah.
Couldn't. And
that's a common reaction. And that's one of the things that delays abortions for people is they're in denial. Like it's like,
I was in heavy denial. And honestly, the only thing that, I was in heavy denial. The only thing that rushed the process for me was
fear.
I had finals coming up. And then after that, I was going to go home for the summer. And I'm like, I can't go home pregnant for the summer. You know, my parents talked to God. The Holy Spirit's going to snitch on me. And so I was like, I can't go home pregnant. So what I did, there was some sort of like life resource, like women's health resource center, whatever, where you could get free medical attention in the town where I was attending college. So I'm thinking they're going to help me, right? I go and I took the pregnancy test from them, and it looked like the same one from the Dollar Tree. So I'm like, y'all really not about to help me. Y'all broke just like me taking these Dollar Tree tests. So took the test and it came out positive, and the two girls in there were trying to convince me to keep the child. And I remember telling them at 20, I said, look, this is cute and I respect your views completely, but y'all aren't going to be here at 3 a.m. when my baby has an ear infection and I have no money to help them or just anything. So
that's a thing. Yeah. That's a thing where religious groups try to convince women, and they say they're going to be there and they're not. They give them a couple things of diapers and they're not there.
And that's it. And I had, drive to another town for the procedure because there was nothing available where I was. So thinking about women now who actually have to leave the state for a procedure. And it wasn't easy because when I showed up already, this is a nerve-wracking thing. And again, I'm able to respect opposing views, but there were so many protesters and like crowding the clinic. The clinic had to postpone procedures because the doctor who was able to perform them hadn't been able to do so in 2 weeks. So there were like 50 women that day getting procedures. So I really would have only been there a couple of hours. I was there late into the evening.
God, that's terrible.
Yeah. I ended up actually passing out because I didn't eat. They told me not to. Yeah, I used to eat breakfast every morning, and they were like, don't eat anything more than this. And then by 3 o'clock, they still hadn't seen me. And I want people to consider, I'm sharing that as hard as it is for me to say this. And I've had to work through a lot of shame surrounding that, just to be able to get to this point several years later and share that. But I'm sharing that to not with the intention of persuading people, but just to add a human element so you can understand that this is not something that many people are going to come up and be like, hey, me too. Like I didn't want to for a long time, but so people can actually understand the complexity, the denial, it's not easy to come to a decision like that. And then what actually happens once you have the procedure. So even like you spoke about your friend and her husband having to make that decision, I imagine that wasn't an easy decision that they came to lightly.
Right. But he does. Yeah. I mean, I think you had asked me before about historically. So in the 80s, when I was involved, I mean, there were so many, like the protests were so intense. Mm-hmm. I was in Boston at the time. There was that guy that shot up the 2 clinics, killed a doctor, killed a secretary. I mean, the culture of the time after Roe versus Wade was just, I don't know, it was just riling people up. Like this, I started earlier telling you, like, I mean, this idea that somehow the union of the sperm and the egg is just so, whatever groups think it's so divine, that's, first of all, that's only some religions now that believe that. It's not a universal thing. There's plenty of religions that don't believe that. But it became this, like, I don't know, manipulation or rallying cry or something, where people took it upon themselves to call the doctors who were saving women's lives, or for women that didn't want to be pregnant, that all, it was that now it's their business. They felt entitled that they can go and protest against you and all the people at the clinics and shoot doctors. I mean, it was really, really bad after 80s and 90s. And then I forget, like, when one of the reasons when Clinton became president, he did put in place some strengthening laws to kind of bat that down. Well, you've heard about that now, like protesters can't go up to the doors, they use the RICO things to help protect women. But, one of the things they did back then was to say that government funds couldn't be used to fund abortion, which means that if you're on Medicaid or you're in the military, you're out of luck. You cannot, other people with private insurance, no problem, but you're out of luck. So, but back in those days, birth control wasn't even covered in insurance.
Yes. Can you expand on that, because we touched on that briefly during our pre-recording call, and I think that's important that the listeners are educated and have that information.
Yeah, I mean, I think women were really stuck. There's this whole group of activists that wanted to outlaw abortion or make it almost impossible, and at the same time, they didn't want you to use birth control either. So we have community health, federally qualified community health clinics all over the country. And they used to always give out birth control and stuff. That became very hard over time. And then, state by state might have passed laws to make birth control covered, but it wasn't until the Affordable Care Act that it was mandated for the whole country. But the South, states in the South, they weren't covering mammograms either. So that is not a surprise that they don't cover women's health care. But I think a particular affront came during the Affordable Care Act, when the Hobby Lobby Association, I don't know if they sued or they went to court, and then they said, well, employers can't be forced to, cover birth control if it's against their religious rights. So now their employees have to conform to the owner's religious rights. So they won. So Hobby Lobby and any company that wants to follow suit, wants to do the same, does not have to pay for birth control as part of their insurance package. And again, these are some of the same people that are anti-abortion too. I'm speechless, obviously.
No, and so I want to ask you, and if I'm not on the right path, please tell me. But in your experience, is it deeper than using religious beliefs as a motivation? Is it like I'm sorry, I don't have a vast understanding. I'm starting to learn the industry more, but could it be that that is just a front for some of these companies and they really just want to avoid the cost of birth control?
No.
Or am I way off on that?
No, birth control is really cheap.
Okay. So it actually is the religious front, like just trying to.
First of all, birth control is cheap, but having a baby is expensive. So it costs the companies a lot more money if their employees got pregnant.
Yeah, this is true.
They followed the laws and didn't fire them first. But so yeah, it's not a cost savings. Not a cost savings. It's way cheaper to pay for an abortion or birth control.
Listen, I agree,
but
and I think that's wild.
Yeah, and the other thing is, the states that don't really teach good sex ed and don't have good protection, like here in Georgia, you like in other states, you can go to your health clinic in your school, and the nurse can give you birth, condoms and things to protect you. But in other states, no, they can't do that. And so, you have much higher teen pregnancy rates in the South and other states. And it's just a shame, they don't want to teach you, and then they don't want to protect you. And even if the whole reproductive rights thing, you don't agree with, what about STDs and infections? People can really affect their, not only, their physical health at the time, but it can make you sterile if you don't get treated. So I don't understand, like, why there's such an aversion still. There's no evidence that teaching young people about their bodies and protection encourages sexual activity. Actually, it's been proven time and
again.
Yeah, but it's still a policy in a lot of states. Sometimes they call it abstinence plus, but the abstinence only curricula is still pretty popular.
To catch up to where we are currently with things in a large part of this conversation. So on June 24th of 2022, the Supreme Court ruled on the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe versus Wade. This ruling gave states the ability to set their own policies protecting or banning abortion without any federal standard protecting access to abortion. So can you educate us and help us understand on how this case was actually able to be overturned?
Oh gosh, so that's $1 million question. You may have to write a book on that one, Jessica. Well, there have been states, since Roe versus Wade, there have been states that have been trying to overturn that for Republican legislatures for years. But apparently, there was more of a coordinated effort to put in place laws. They're all conservative legislatures in different states to put in laws that they knew were unconstitutional, so that they could challenge it. So like I'm here in Georgia, so they put this heartbeat ban in, knowing it would be challenged in the courts. So other states were doing the same thing. So eventually it went up to the Supreme Court, and that was why so many groups supported Donald Trump when he was the candidate, because he pledged to put people on the Supreme Court, justices who would overturn Roe versus Wade, and he did. And so there were when the court became more conservative and these state level laws got challenged, and so the justices choose, what lawsuits they want to review every year, and what they want to hear. And so, of course, they chose to listen to a case that would overturn Roe versus Wade, which is what they did. So as soon as they could, they took a case and found some. I still don't understand. I don't think a lot of legal scholars think it's very solid, but found a way to make Roe versus Wade go away. And so now it's back like it was before the 1972 case, where now each state can have their own laws. Now, some state constitutions are stronger than others or interpreted differently than others. So, to me, what is the happiness or whatever? Maybe that's the Declaration of Independence. But anyway, to me, there's plenty of things in any constitution that would allow a woman to make a decision about whether she wants to have a pregnancy or not. But that's just, some of us in this country think that.
Yes.
So when that law was nullified, then states who had these previously unconstitutional bans were able to be put in effect, because they are no longer unconstitutional. And so that's why you have so many bans going on across the country right now. So you'd have to have each state have, a protection, or you'd have to have Congress pass a law to make something like reproductive law again, which Democrats have been trying to do, but they don't have enough votes. The Congress is too divided. They have a certain number of votes. So, the president would have to sign it. So obviously Trump would never sign something like that when he was president. But so even though the Democrats have the House, even if the Congress passed the law, it depends on the president has to sign it, right? So you need enough senators and representatives and the president that would sign a law like that. So that's why. that's what's the problem now, right? Is you don't have legislators who believe that a woman has the right to decide whether she wants to be pregnant or not. So, yeah.
And which leads me to, so following the overturning, which you spoke about the bans, just to provide context to everyone, we now have 13 states that have enacted a total abortion ban. 28 states have abortion bans based on gestational duration. 8 states ban abortion at or above 18 weeks gestation. 20 states ban abortion at some point after 18 weeks. So, can we talk about the states that have total bans with absolutely no exceptions? What does this mean for a woman who doesn't want to carry full term or medically is not able to carry full term?
And I think too, I get a little bit disappointed when I hear like experts or media talking about 6 weeks, because like you said before, people don't know they're pregnant. I mean,
No.
that just to me is another manipulation. They say 6 weeks to give sympathetic people out there like, wow, the woman has, 6 weeks. It's really, they should have just banned it, because by the time you know you're pregnant anyhow, whatever, it could be 6 weeks, 10 weeks. Some people don't even know more than that. So that's ridiculous. I mean, there's that's just, and then all of us are saying, oh, people don't even know. I mean, it's just a ban. It's flat out, right? And so if you live in a state that doesn't have any legal options for you, now there have been states that are trying to ban women from going to another state to get one, but I know, right? So that, we're supposed to be a free country, but we've got some fascist ideologies going on here. So you can travel to another state that has a legal abortion
if you have the means.
And there are a lot of groups out there that will help you. And there's some states trying to ban those too. Like if you had a nonprofit or a group in your state and you were trying to help somebody else, there's laws, people trying to stop that too. You could have a telehealth visit and have the oral treatment to end the pregnancy, which would bring on a period. That's very controversial right now. So you could take the medicine to bring on a period. And that's what they used to say years ago. Nobody ever called it abortion. They're like, just bring on the period, which would end the pregnancy, right? That's really what it is.
It's not an abortion.
It's become like a term, but it really used to be just bring on a period. So that's why I said earlier, sometimes women don't even know they are having a miscarriage because they just have a really heavy period that's painful, and it may be, but that's your options: a telehealth visit or traveling, depending on your situation, to a state that has a range in your time frame. And then if you have a telehealth visit, I think there's requirements about follow-up.
As we were talking about the bans, I just wanted to touch on the women patients that are affected who need an abortion for medical reasons or have received an abortion and need further medical attention. So in a case of currently residing in the state of Georgia, I want to acknowledge Amber Nicole Thurman. She is a young lady who was a resident of the state of Georgia, and she recently passed from an infection from taking abortion pills, and she encountered an extremely rare complication. Her body had not expelled all of the fetal tissue from her uterus. So she showed up at a hospital in the Atlanta metro area in need of a routine procedure to clear it from her uterus. This procedure is called a dilation and curettage, or a DNC. But this summer, which was just a few months before this happened, Georgia made performing the procedure a felony with very few exceptions. So any doctor who violated this new Georgia law could be prosecuted and face up to a decade in prison. So Amber waited in pain in a hospital bed, worried about what would happen to her. She also had a 6-year-old son. So keep in mind that she already was a mother. And the doctors monitored her infection, but her blood pressure continued to sink. Her organs began to fail. And unfortunately, doctors were finally able to operate. But at this point, it was just too late. And she just succumbed to the infection and unfortunately, very unfortunately, lost her life. So I just want to honor her in this moment by speaking that this is something that potentially could have been avoided. I want to be careful with the words that I use and be sensitive in this situation. But I wanted to acknowledge that in correlation of what we're speaking about as far as the bans, because Amber unfortunately has not and will not be the only woman affected by this. So are you able to educate the listeners a little more on what this means for medical professionals in terms of being able to provide care to their patients?
Well, I think the issue that keeps coming up is these laws that are being put across the state they're like I said earlier, they're not based in science. Like, what does that mean, the life of the mother? How does a doctor or nurse or medical provider, or midwife, whatever, how do they interpret that?
Mm-hmm.
So, I've heard interviews with legislators that are like, oh, the doctor should have known this and that. Well, no, the laws should be specific, and they should be something that is understandable to any reasonable person, not just the person who wrote the laws. So this is one of the outcomes of getting rid of Roe versus Wade. Now you have a patchwork of laws across the country that people can't interpret. Doctors already have a stressful job. They already carry, malpractice insurance. They don't know what to do. There could be people in their same hospital or clinic that have different political views of them and might, turn them in or accuse them of something. So the medical profession is in a very hard spot. And so what happens is they're going to be more cautious, right? In terms like Amber, and she's not the only one. There's other women that have died, and there's a lot of many women who have suffered. And, I've heard other experts. I'm not in that field, but I've heard other experts saying that doctors don't even want to practice in these states. They don't want to be put in that position where they have those kind of decisions. So they're not going to, if they feel like the law's saying one thing and they've got their whole career on the line, it's not just to protect their career, but it's, if they get arrested and go to jail, then what happens? No other of their patients can be treated after that.
Exactly.
So, it's, or not even to go to jail, but to get arrested and have to go to court and have to hire lawyers and fight something like this. These laws are an outgrowth of this getting rid of Roe versus Wade and not having a national protection yet. I say yet because I'm hopeful that Americans will listen to your show and read and realize that they need legislators that will protect women and their families. And it's not just the women. A lot of times these are women who already have other children.
Yes. And that's why I highlighted that. I'm glad that you mentioned that. That's why I wanted to highlight that in Amber's case, that she already had a son. And if the premise behind the opposition, the opposing argument on this topic is the life of a child, well, we're talking about a young woman who already had a child and was going to school to better her life, better her son's life. And now that's not even a possibility. Now her son is left motherless because of these laws. And it is putting physicians in a difficult position because it was almost 24 hours later that they were able to help her. So I can only imagine the pain that she was in leading up to her death And not only could that pain have been prevented, but her death could have been potentially prevented.
Yeah,
So,
or could have been. You know, those pills that you mentioned, they're hormones. I mean, women have
mhm,
been taking them for many different
mhm,
things over time. I had a
mhm,
stillbirth when
mhm,
I was 43, and
mhm,
you know, you don't want somebody to carry a dead fetus for
mhm.
another 5 months. I mean,
No.
besides the fact that she can't function, and I had another child at the time too. Besides that, you can't function. Those that medication is integral to women's health. So I think when you're saying, and people rightly talk about the health of women, it's like, oh my God, now you're taking a very customary hormone treatment that's
Mhm,
used in a lot of different ways, and you're trying to tie it to this strange concept that that you're going to be killing unborn children.
mhm,
You can see in Amber's case, there are no onboard children there. There aren't the fetus was already gone, right? There
mhm.
wasn't an unborn child there. So
Not at all. And I just also want to thank you for, in addition to sharing your passion and your expertise with us, being willing to share your personal experience as well. And I'm sorry that I imagine that was not an easy thing at the time. So I thank you for being willing to share that with us.
yeah, I mean, I knew it was a risk. I was older, but a
Mhm,
lot of times there are women my age, and the pregnancy does limp along, but then
mhm,
they find out later that it's not going to be viable, or it has a severe disability. I not disability, but I think people have to realize is that just because you can do something, because modern medicine says, oh yeah, you can save, you know, uh, a fetus. Is that the right thing is that the right thing to do? You know,
mhm.
you have to make, and for politicians to make those decisions. I mean, it's just unconscionable. There's so many
Mhm.
different layers to that. So it's you know, if uh, if women's um, bodies didn't have medical intervention, also there may be more spontaneous abortions, also, well, miscarriages, but
Mhm.
um, or they would have just died. There would have been
Yeah.
sepsis, and women would die. Like I could have died when I had the stillbirth, but I didn't because there was the hormone treatment. But the other thing I think is important for people to realize is this whole debate about saving the unborn child. It's not like the fetus or the embryo is disconnected from the woman's body. I mean, all of her nutrition and hormones, um, you know, she could have other medical concerns and be taking, she could have chemotherapy or whatever. She could have mental illness. She could be having
Mhm.
stress from other things. Like, what if you just lost your mother, had all this trauma, and now you're pregnant? I mean, the fetus is going to absorb the
That.
cortisol. It's not like
Mhm.
you're separate. So to force people who don't want to be pregnant to carry a pregnancy when there's other things in their lives that they're dealing with is, I mean, if these people really care about unborn children, they would care about, having the growth of a child in the best way possible, and giving a stability to the woman who's going to be carrying the baby and having the child afterwards. But I mean, I've watched this over the years. Do you know how many children are in foster care? Thousands and thousands of children in foster care. Why don't we
And
do something about that?
do something about that. And that's why I wanted to ask you as well, because you spoke about your background, working as a social worker.
Mhm.
Can you expand on the correlation with that? Because I agree that that is something that needs to be addressed, and that's something that, in my personal opinion, needs to be addressed before putting all these abortion bans in place. to protect these children that already do exist and may not and don't have a healthy home life, whatever that scenario looks like. Can you expand on the correlation in terms of this topic for us?
Well, there is a correlation between women or the partners, the fathers that are suffering from some severe mental illness that is untreated, that cannot parent. Like that's in a lot of cases, that's why the state takes the children into foster care. So there's a subset that you know you can't parent a baby when you're hallucinating, for example. You have untreated illness. Now, you can, there is better treatments now. People are doing well, but pregnancy can also cause other hormone imbalances. And if you don't have a supportive environment or you don't have medical care, it's very difficult. But that is why the state often intervenes and takes children, is because there's mental illness in the home. Then there could be people, suffering from PTSD, or have, sociopaths or other violent tendencies. So, and then there's people like we were talking about earlier, they just don't really want to be pregnant or want to have kids, and, maybe don't have the best home life. And then there's a lot of people with substance abuse problems. So, but, another thing is there's a lot of children born with disabilities that end up in foster care because either the parents cannot
okay.
So a subset of children in foster care that have severe disabilities, and there's specialized foster homes.
Okay.
But those are this country does not really have a good setup for reunification, and so I mean, I think with these bans, you're going to have more of this. You're going to have more families that don't have the capacity, either at the mother or spousal level, or their families, to really take care of these kids. So a lot of times they end up in terrible situations, and there's too much child abuse in this country anyway. Mm-hmm. So I would have liked to see these people that want to have bans and want to prevent birth control to be doing something for the children that are already with us and take care of them first.
Mm-hmm.
But
I agree.
It's and there's an overlap between the states that have really severe bans and very poor child abuse outcomes, like a lot of kids that die in foster care or before they get in foster care. There's a very low safety nets, and a lot of these states have mantras of like they don't want government investment, or didn't use all the COVID funds, like didn't put counselors in schools during COVID or whatnot. So there's a lot of children that suffered during COVID. And so what are these same states that didn't want to have counseling in schools now want to force you to be pregnant and babies to be born? And what happens to them after that? Like, it should be a little bit more looking inside before you tell other people what to do. What can you do better to make the lives of children better before you tell a bunch of women that they have to be pregnant?
When they may not be ready or able, or just have no desire to. So I wanted to ask.
If you have I was going to say, if you have a substance abuse problem, you do see a lot of pregnancies that they're not thinking straight, or they're getting raped more. So you do have more. You have a lot of substance abuse. You have more STDs, and you have more pregnancies. So that's a problem.
And it's a ripple effect. Okay. I want to ask, so having had the experience in social work, I'm just curious to know if it's too optimistic for me to wonder if the same effort that is being put towards this issue of reproductive rights and bans, if that same effort and potential resources could be put towards foster care, perhaps someone who may have found themselves pregnant and they may be currently struggling with a substance abuse problem, and it's made aware by a medical provider or just someone in this person's life. If these resources can be put in place to this, let's just say I'm someone who has decided or been forced to keep my child, preferably decided to keep my child.
Well, there are models, and I was very involved in that in my social work, where you have women who are struggling, so you can have like a residential home for women who are pregnant and then the baby, and help them clean or deal with what other mental health issues they might have. Yeah, because you don't, I mean, ideally, you want to keep the woman with the baby, right? Ideally, if possible. Right. So yeah, there's tons of models like that where that's worked. But too often the states will just come in and grab the baby out in the hospital without trying to help the mother, without helping the baby. And that is terrible for the baby. And even if they reunify them later, you're still missing. You're missing a lot in those first couple months. Missing those, all kinds of attachment disorders. It's terrible. So yeah, I mean, it is possible, but it costs money, and the state would have to fund it. And you're talking about states that don't like to put money into social services. So yeah, it's a tragedy, really, because just because you have a substance abuse issue, does that mean you can't be a good mother? No, you might
not at all.
Treatment, right?
Not at all, because I heard I saw this quote before, and it said something, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something along the lines of, people often ask, like, why the drug abuse, or something along those lines, or why the addiction, rather. But rarely do people ask why the pain, because there's a reason why someone is struggling with this, with substance abuse, right? And I think, especially if you claim to be looking at this from a faith-based perspective, then the reality is, as a believer, as I'm growing in my walk, I have to take a step back and look at this issue as Jesus would, which is seeing that person in pain and addressing, not persecuting them, but putting things in place to help them. Because the reality is, there's something that we all struggle with. Some of us, our struggles just may be more at the forefront and maybe more obvious.
Well, I mean, all these things that, you and I can talk about very rationally, what are good to do, they all cost money. And if the state doesn't want to spend money on it, it's just, this is what I think is so short-sighted, though, right? They don't want to fund these states, these extreme states that have the abortion bans and the laws. They don't want to fund, they don't want to help the woman and maybe her partner too at the time, be together and raise a healthy child and have a healthy family. But they're going to spend the money somewhere. They're going to spend the money in foster care. They're going to spend money in prison. The money's going to go, or people are going to suffer, or there's a lot more, child death rates in these same states too. Accidents or abuse. And it's tragic, really. And of course, this has been going on for years with the crack cocaine epidemic, which is when I was a social worker. But now some of these states are becoming like, oh, we got to do something now. It's like a lot of white people are addicted to fentanyl or whatever. So now there's a little
it's an issue.
There's a little bit more, sympathy maybe. But the reality is that, I think there's a misnomer. You can go back and read in the Supreme Court ruling by Justice Alito. He cites the CDC saying that there's a low level of adoption numbers. It's kind of saying, like, it's not a problem to be forced to be pregnant and then if you don't want the baby, to give it away, right? So he's not acknowledging or has no clue how hard it is to be pregnant for 40 weeks. It's not 9 months, it's 40 weeks. He has no understanding about that. It's like, oh, just give the baby away, right? So he's thinking, oh, well, there's not that many babies going up for adoption, so no problem to force women to have a baby. So you can check that and read that on there. But here's the thing: if the baby has is not healthy, has a medical problem or a physical disability, or is not white, in most cases not white, there's not a market for adoption of all babies. There's only a market for generally adopting healthy babies, and mostly white babies. Now it's a little bit better now because people aren't, there's a lot of mixed race couples stuff, but for a while there it was really harder. So he gave as his rationale for forcing women to have a baby that you can just give your baby away. And most people will tell you that is not an option, and it shouldn't be an option if you want to be a parent. It's much better if you want to be able to get some support to parent. But if you are addicted to methamphetamines and have a baby, and that baby's going to be addicted too. So it's going to be harder to, you don't know the outcome of the drugs, how much the baby had, or it's probably very low birth weight. It could have all kinds of medical problems. That is not apparent at birth, those things. So I think a lot of these people are very idealistic. They think, oh, just have the baby and give it away. Like I hear that all the time. Give it away. And that's not how it works.
At all. And I'm glad that you highlighted that as being very idealistic. And I just want to say I am a big proponent of adoption. It's actually something I would like to explore potentially for myself at some point when I desire to be a parent. Right. So that's not at all what we're saying. I'm not suggesting that's what you're not saying, but we have to acknowledge the reality of what these children face, simply because that's being pushed from the opposing side as, oh, we'll just put it up for adoption.
But you have to remember, you and I might adopt a 3 or 4-year-old or someone that has cognitive delay or a physical disability, but most people don't. Most people want perfect babies. They want a surrogate. They want to control the pregnancy. They want to make sure the surrogate is well fed and has all their medication. Most people are not just going to go into, the foster care system and then adopt a 3 or 4 or maybe, or definitely not a 6 or 7 or an 8 or 9 or 10 or teenager. Those teenagers never get adopted.
I agree. And that's a very, very true statement. I'm glad you addressed that, because I actually have a girlfriend who was a social worker as well. And I was sharing my desire with her one day, and she was educating me. She was like, yeah, like I'm fully for it. Just, this is the education you would need to have. And just on, like you said, like not many teenagers get adopted, and then they eventually age out of the system they have no support, no support from the family that they were placed with a lot of times, and then no proper support from the family, from their biological family. And I agree with you. I do think it's an unfortunate thing that a lot of people do want a perfect baby. Whereas for me, I just desire to be a mother.
Right.
Whatever that looks like.
Right. Did you know at a certain age you can't even adopt?
I did not know that.
Yes, there's an age cutoff. I'm
not sure. Do you know what the age is?
No, but I think it's different for men and women too. I don't think it's the same for some reason.
I did not know that. Yeah. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, when I was looking into it when I was 50, definitely couldn't, but it could be younger. Yeah. And I could be a very healthy 50-year-old and you could be a very unhealthy 30-year-old, and I
Yeah.
might live to be 90 and you might live to be 50. I mean, it's like but there are rules. But I think what the bigger picture is here, that what Justice Alito was writing and what's in some is
Mm-hmm.
that, oh well, just give the baby up for adoption. Like it's not a completely heart-wrenching situation for
Exactly.
people. Or they, like you were talking about earlier, you think that you're going to be able to be a good parent. You go into it thinking that, or you don't know. Like you said earlier, you don't know if your kid's going to have an ear infection, but a lot of teenage mothers I've worked with, they have no idea what they're getting into.
Mm-hmm.
No idea. They
Mm-hmm.
have no idea how hard it is to be a parent. And so they keep the baby knowing and not knowing what to expect. They don't have any supports, and that's where there's a lot of resentment, a lot of problems. But yeah, most people don't want to do adoption. They want to try it, which makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if they wanted to keep the pregnancies because they want to try to be a parent.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, I know you spoke about, obviously, we spoke about the child abuse element and the number of children that die as a result of that. Something else I wanted to educate the listeners on, as well as on. So, because of the ban, there was an increase in infant mortality rates. According to an article published by the Washington Post, which I'll be sure to link in the episode summary, the rate of increase was actually 7%. One of the contributing factors to this is that women who have unplanned pregnancies are less likely to be able to receive proper medical attention during their pregnancy and even afterwards. So I really wanted to talk about the effect of this in marginalized communities, because it also states in this article, there was someone who did a study and took this a step further, and they found that Black babies are actually more prone to this infant mortality rate in these cases. Can we talk about, just explore the effects on marginalized communities with this?
I haven't seen the data, but most of the southern states don't have expanded Medicaid, right? So if you don't have expanded Medicaid, you don't have as many options to get medical care. Now, if you're pregnant, you can get, and you're very poor, you can get Medicaid. But if you're not poor enough, right, and you don't have insurance from your job, you don't have, and you would have to pay out of pocket, right? So I think that there's probably a big cross section of the country that is not poor enough for Medicaid, that or doesn't know they can get it, or face a lot of obstacles. So you need the medical care right away. So it takes 2 months to sign up. You don't know where to go to get it. You could not be getting any medical care during that time. But there is just a lot of big parts of the country that are very rural. There's just not a lot of medical care. There's not a lot of OBGYNs, and there's not trained people. So you might be going to your general practitioner, but they don't really know what's going on with the pregnancy. And so you're not going to get that. So I think that if you don't really want to be pregnant and you're forced to be pregnant, and now you have to find medical insurance and medical care and find a provider, it's going to be really hard. You're not going to, it's going to be a very tough road. And so that's probably why you're going to see more complications. And you could have, like we talked about earlier, you might have an STD that's untreated. You don't know you have it. So that could cause complications with the pregnancy as well. But lots of people have medical issues, but they don't have medication for them. So they could be not already taking care of their own body, let alone another one. So I think that it's a bigger problem in this country, and and just providing medical insurance and care in general. But yeah,
Of course.
yeah. And
I
so when you say
totally
marginalized communities, Black communities, it's because a lot of Black Americans live in these states without
agree.
expanded Medicaid and without a lot of health care. So like Massachusetts, I think Maine, they have more universal
Mhm,
health, like so everybody basically has insurance. California
mhm,
has something, pretty expansive,
mhm.
but there's a lot of states really don't have anything like this. And so then you don't have medical providers either because they're not getting paid. They're not,
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And what's actually interesting is in one of the earlier episodes in the season, I did a series titled 30, Flirty, and Thriving to explore. I feel like there's such a fear and a negative connotation around turning 30, whereas I was really excited about it. So I wanted to touch on all the um, negative connotations around it. So one of the episodes was discussing health after 30. And I
Uh,
had a very lovely doctor on, Dr. Carla Booker. And one of the things she spoke about is if you're able to, one way to try to have a healthy pregnancy, right? It's not all in your control. That wasn't what she was saying, but is to try to have a planned pregnancy because then you're already preparing yourself
exactly.
mentally, financially, as well as physically.
Right.
Well, if you're not in a situation where it's not planned and you don't have these things in place,
Right.
I just share that just to aid in your point of what you just mentioned. If it's an unplanned pregnancy, and now I'm tasked with coming up with resources, finding medical attention, if I'm even in an area where that may or may not exist, it's just
Hmm.
stress on top of stress. So I just wanted to mention that to go with your point.
Yeah, I mean, in some companies too, like maybe you've been living with somebody for years, but you're not married. And so then when you
Mhm,
get on their insurance, maybe you can't get covered for 3 months, So then
mhm,
what happens? You've got 3 months with and that's pretty common where companies, or you just join a company. It's very common companies don't insure you for the first couple months. So,
mhm.
no, there's no rules that say, well, just because you're pregnant, now they have to cover you. But I think
Right.
what you're saying, Dr. Booker said is that it goes to this whole debate about this, so-called love of the unborn child is this pregnancy that is not expected and not planned. How do the people that feel this divinity of of this unplanned pregnancy that they don't understand that if you want to have a healthy developed fetus and future human, you the woman has to be sleep and well nourished and not a lot of stress and certainly not be in a domestic violence relationship and housed. If you really care about having a the child, then why aren't all these other things just as important or more important? They're just
Mhm,
not part of it's their it's just not part of their philosophy, or they don't understand what a pregnancy is, perhaps.
mhm. So I want to ask you, I want to be able to close out our conversation with just two questions. So the first question is, where do you, based on the information that we have available right now and just your experience, where do you see us? Obviously, there's been regression, um, but I have to have some optimism that conversations are being had around the frustration with the regression, but it takes a lot more than conversations. There has to be action. Like we talked about earlier, resources have to be available, funding. Where do you see the movement going at this point? Obviously, we have a very big decision coming up in November. So I just want to try to shed some light on potentially not what necessarily what we can expect in the outcome of this election, but just what we can foresee within the movement.
Well, one of the candidates, Harris, she talked about lifting the filibuster so that they could there could be a law passed to protect reproductive rights,
Mm-hmm.
because what that'll do is overcome the current law where you need more than 60 senators to pass law.
Right.
So, I mean, it depends on what happens at the Senate level. It depends on where your listeners are from, and what states. Like, I'm from Georgia, so we have 2 senators that are very really care about women and really care about children and healthy children. So we're good, but there are plenty of other states where it's just a more reactive. It's all about the unborn child. And those states, if depending on who gets elected, will decide what happens to the Senate, and the same for the House. So it's the Senate where you need the 60 votes. So I think that you've got but every 2 years, 2 years there'll be another race, and there'll be some more. Congress will change again, so there is opportunities every 2 years to have a different makeup in the legislature. So depending on who the president is, they'll either sign or not sign what the legislature gives them. And then in each state, they can pass laws for their state right now, and that is unfortunately uses a lot of resources, because it means that people really have to focus on their own state and not sort of on a national protection. And so that really divides up the activists. There's not that many activists out. There's not that many people out there that really care doing anything about this topic. So there's just not much. There's groups around, but there's not that much happening. I mean, we have a very strong group here called Sister Song in Georgia. I actually worked for them for a little while. That they're the ones that took the state to court about the ban here in Georgia. But that has to happen in all those states, and that uses a lot of time and money and effort, as opposed to national focus. So it's going to be a dispersed state by state, territory by territory effort until there's a national law. And we have territories too, like Washington D.C., Guam, and Puerto Rico. So it's not just the states. So yeah, what happens this election every 2 years is going to decide what happens at the national level, and then everybody has their own states that they can work. But a lot of people in this country, they don't really care too much about the national, because in their state it's protected. So they don't know what it's like to be living in Georgia.
Right.
So you don't have the same level of activism you had in the 70s and then in the 80s, because now a lot of states, like you were giving those statistics, a lot of states that very highly populated states, it doesn't affect them. They're fine. Their children are fine. Their grandchildren are fine. It's the other states that people aren't fine.
Right.
So
exactly.
Yeah, so it's tough right now, because there's a lot of women, like you were talking about, marginalized women in particular, that are really, really affected by this. And then there's a lot of women in other states who are just like, what's the big deal? No. I mean, I think most women care, but they don't. It's not as imminent for them.
No, I understand. It's not. It may not be at their front door.
Yeah, they've got other concerns that are overpowering them. I want to make a plug to get rid of you have there's another because we're just talking about the United States, but it is really hard for women around the world. And the United States has been on the forefront of reducing infectious diseases, vaccinating children, reducing all kinds of you step on a nail in another country, you don't have a tetanus shot, you can die just from stepping on a nail. So and pregnancy your immune system is depressed, right, when you're pregnant, so you don't kick out the embryo or fetus, so your immune system is lower, but it means you're really susceptible to other infections.
Right.
So if you live well, we were talking about this earlier. You can have infections here. There's a lot of pregnant women that don't want to get pregnant people who don't want to get the flu shot, which is insane. So you don't want to have an infection when you're pregnant, but we have a law here that says the United States government cannot help a nonprofit, any group that is trying to keep women alive that may also need an abortion. It's essentially an abortion ban. It's about funding. So you'll have doctors who cannot save a woman's life and jeopardize their funding, their global funding from the United States. And it's probably, I don't know the numbers, but it has really affected, thousands and thousands of women over the years. I think it was put in 1977, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also the rules that affect the women here, in the military and stuff. So it has really affected a lot of women. It's called the Hyde Amendment.
I believe it. I believe it. It's very, like I said several times in our conversation, it's very layered. I want to ask you, what would you encourage our listeners to do if this is something that they're passionate about, or from this conversation they've realized, hey, I really want to take action, I'm passionate about this? And then is there anything that we haven't said that you want to really leave them with in our conversation?
Well, I guess no rights come for free,
Okay.
Rights. People have fought for social justice for, probably eternity. So, I'm not sure, like, when I hear women talk about, like, they don't think the women's movement affected them or it's been important, but we wouldn't even be having this conversation if it wasn't for women's movement. So it is, you cannot take it for granted that there are people that want to, tell you what to do. And I mean, there have been laws, like Virginia trying to pass a law that you had to have an invasive ultrasound when you were pregnant before you got an abortion. Invasive, not external.
Yeah.
I mean, these are government. These are rules or different levels of government that, I think people probably need to find out what's going on in their own state, but maybe help women in other states that you mentioned earlier. There's, sometimes you need help from your sisters and brothers and other places because you're stuck in a situation that you can't get out of.
I agree.
I don't have anything.
No, I think that's very impactful. And I'll repeat something that I said on our environmental policies episode. Just what I have been saying is this should be the mindset in every election, but I think in particularly with this election, before you cast your vote, this is my opinion, this is not Alison's. I just want to make that known that to vote not based on your own interests and what is at your front door, but think about your neighbor and think about how these issues affect everyone across the country. Just because you might be solid right now in your life with a certain topic, consider those who may be less fortunate, may be marginalized, may be in a different situation. And so that's what I want to leave everyone with. And I'm also going to link some reproductive justice organizations in our episode summary.
One thing that comes up a lot in election years is this talk about the economics versus social issues.
Yes.
Being forced to be pregnant is an economic
issue. Yeah.
It affects the woman, and it affects her children, it affects if she's married or her partner. There is no separation between economics and pregnancy. And let me tell you, if people are worried about the cost of eggs or other things or inflation now, when we have a lot more children that people can't take care of or don't want to take care of, it's going to cost you. It's not a free, this is not a free decision.
No.
There's going to be thousands and thousands of children born that are going to need either state care or families to be subsidized to help keep those children eating and healthy and have medical care. This is not free. This is not separate from the economic, although, you know, that whole thing is another. The separate fiscal and economic prosperity from being forced to have children you don't want is just illogical.
The funding has to come from somewhere. I'm glad you mentioned that, because again, we have to meet people where they're at, right? And so the economic portion of this may be at the forefront of someone's brain, so they're not able to, and it's not something that's at their front door at this moment, so they're not able to rationalize why they should consider this when making their decision. So I'm glad that you said that.
Yeah. Plus, you know, we didn't say this before, but a lot of people that can't travel and that can't go out of state to have an abortion, they're having babies. They're going to be using Medicaid. That is all of our money. So to think that this is not going to affect your pocketbook, that is just,
it will.
That is,
it will 100%.
That's just ridiculous.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree. And so I wanted to ask you, this is the portion of the episode where I like to give my guests the opportunity to plug themselves, share anything any projects that you're currently working on that we can expect release from, just anything. And I wanted to highlight for you, I know you were an editor of some amazing books that I'm going to share with the listeners in our episode bio. So yes, hold it up. Tell the people about it, girlfriend.
So for those of you who don't know Our Bodies, Our Selves, years ago when Obama was running for president, he said that he got, on the Colbert Show, he said he got his sister a copy of Our Bodies, Our Selves for Christmas. And people were like, whoa, what's that? Now this started in the early 70s, and it's a collective. So it's the chapters are written by experts in all different fields, but this was really what changed a lot about women's health. It's online now. They don't do a print anymore, but there's one about menopause. There's one for teenagers called Changing Bodies, Changing Selves. But these were the Bibles for women's health and inspired my activism and a lot of other people. So they're great. They're great resources. You know, some of it's kind of dated now, but it's still they're still great resources. So
good bones are good bones.
Yeah, and they do work internationally too. So they support women in other countries. So you can support. The founders and the directors have testified in Congress many times and have been on the forefront of a lot of great changes for women's health.
Yeah. So I'm definitely going to link that for the listeners. You have been such a valuable portion of the movement, clearly, having been an editor of some groundbreaking books. I want to ask you, is there anything else that you want to share with the listeners at this moment? Anything that you'd like us to be on the lookout for and support you in?
Well, this Our Bodies, Our Selves, I was a writer and an editor for 2 issues, but I have a book I did myself. I was asked to write, and it's called it's a book about hirsutism, which is unwanted hair and body image. So it's some of the medical information is a little bit outdated, but it's I can provide you with that and the link on Amazon.
Well, with that, I want to give you a chance. Tell the listeners where they can keep up with you.
Oh, I don't have a social media channel. I got LinkedIn.
Listen, that is all right. That is all right. I'm sure you have a lot more peace and focus without a social footprint. So I support it. And I'll make sure and link these books that you were writer and editor as a part of, because they're very important. Yeah. And I just want to thank you for your activism, for your passion, for really pursuing this on behalf of women that you know personally, that you have never met. The work, it's important, and I just want to give you your flowers and thank you for your willingness to come on and speak with us, educate us more on this topic, as well as, like I said earlier, share your personal story, because I imagine that was not an easy time for you as a woman, as a human being, you know, as a family. I'm sure that was difficult for you all to navigate, and you were already a mother at that time. So I just want to thank you very much for sharing with us.
Yeah. Thanks for the conversation. You're a great interviewer. And I mean, you're the one putting this out there for people, and hopefully are reaching a lot of women or just the general population, right? You have all kinds of followers that I hope are appreciative of all your effort. I think you do a lot of hard work behind the scenes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm just trying to just be obedient and trust the process. And having guests such as yourself is confirmation that I'm on the right path. And I just really hope that there's someone who is blessed by this episode. There is release, and there's education, and there is consideration of a perspective that is different than their own. That's my prayer.
That's all you can do, is broaden people's perspectives.
So, Style Crew, I just want to thank Alison again for her time. And I trust that you, and I hope that you will find value in this episode, and be sure to share it with anyone that you feel can as well. And until next Thursday, we are out, Style Crew. Hey, Style Crew, make sure you're keeping up with our podcast through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, as well as the Podcast Index. And if you'd like to view the podcast visually, check out my YouTube channel, Styled by Jessica Lauren. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at style_and conversation podcast.